Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy does not invite mild disagreement. It provokes fundamental resistance. Critics do not merely question details of his system. They challenge its coherence, realism, and moral consequences. Sartre himself understood this. A philosophy that claims freedom without guarantees must expect opposition without compromise. The first and most persistent criticism is that Sartre overstates human freedom. Critics argue that Sartre's account of radical freedom ignores the depth of psychological conditioning, social constraint, and unconscious motivation. Human beings, they insist, are not blank agents who choose themselves at every moment. Habits, trauma, class, culture, and biology shape action in ways Sartre appears to minimize. From this perspective, Sartre's insistence that we are always responsible risks becoming a moral abstraction. It demands responsibility where genuine control may be absent. Critics see this as a form of ethical cruelty, holding individuals accountable for conditions they did not choose and cannot easily escape. Sartre's language intensifies this concern. When he claims that we are condemned to be free, critics hear an exaggeration bordering on denial. Freedom, they argue, is not universal or evenly distributed. To insist otherwise risks ignoring the lived realities of oppression, disability, and deprivation. This criticism becomes sharper when applied politically. Sartre's early existentialism is accused of being socially blind, focused on individual choice while neglecting systemic constraint. Marxist critics, in particular, accuse Sartre of offering a bourgeois philosophy of freedom that cannot account for class struggle, economic coercion, or institutional power. From this angle, Sartre's freedom appears formal rather than real. Another major criticism targets Sartre's ethics. Sartre famously rejects moral laws, fixed values, and universal principles. Values are created through action, not discovered in advance. Critics argue that this position collapses into moral relativism. If there are no objective moral standards, they ask, how can Sartre condemn injustice, cruelty, or domination? On what basis can he criticize oppression if values are merely chosen? Without moral foundations, responsibility risks becoming arbitrary. This criticism intensifies around violence. Sartre's willingness to tolerate revolutionary violence is seen by many as the logical outcome of his ethics. If values are created through commitment and history demands action, then limits appear negotiable. Critics accuse Sartre of providing philosophical cover for brutality by dissolving moral restraint into historical necessity. This is not a fringe objection. Philosophers, political theorists, and former allies argue that Sartre's thought risks legitimizing harm in the name of engagement. Responsibility without limits, they argue, is indistinguishable from irresponsibility justified by urgency. A related criticism concerns bad faith. Sartre treats bad faith as self-deception, a refusal to acknowledge freedom. Critics argue that this diagnosis oversimplifies human psychology. Self-deception, they suggest, is not always chosen. People often act under pressures they only dimly understand. To frame evasion as moral failure risks blaming individuals for survival strategies. This objection points to a deeper worry. Sartre's philosophy may underestimate vulnerability. By emphasizing agency, critics argue, Sartre neglects dependency, care, and fragility. Human beings are not merely choosers. They are embodied, relational, and often powerless. A philosophy that foregrounds choice risks marginalizing these dimensions. There is also a methodological criticism. Sartre's philosophical style is accused of being excessively abstract, despite its claims to concreteness. Concepts like freedom, responsibility, and choice operate at a level that critics argue does not match lived experience. Everyday life, they insist, is messier, less reflective, and more constrained than Sartre allows. This gap between theory and life fuels skepticism. Finally, critics challenge Sartre's self-understanding as an engaged intellectual. They argue that his political interventions were inconsistent, opportunistic, or naive. Sartre's shifting alliances and controversial stances are cited as evidence that his philosophy lacks stable guidance. Engagement, critics argue, becomes reactive rather than principled. Taken together, these criticisms form a serious challenge. They do not merely disagree with Sartre's conclusions, they question whether his philosophy can sustain the weight he places on it. Is freedom exaggerated? Is responsibility unfairly distributed? Does ethics survive without foundations? Does engagement excuse harm? Sartre does not dismiss these objections. He confronts them, sometimes defensively, sometimes by revision, sometimes by refusal. To understand Sartre fully, we must see how he responds. If the criticisms of Jean-Paul Sartre are serious, then the question cannot simply be whether they misunderstand him. The deeper question is how Sartre himself responds when his philosophy is pressed against its limits. Sartre does not defend his system by closing ranks. He responds by revising, deepening, and sometimes abandoning earlier formulations, without ever surrendering the core demand of responsibility. The first major shift comes in Sartre's response to the charge that he exaggerates freedom. Early existentialism emphasizes radical choice in a way that invites caricature. Sartre later acknowledges that freedom is never exercised in a vacuum. Circumstances matter, materially, historically, and socially. This recognition does not lead Sartre to abandon freedom. It leads him to redefine it. Freedom becomes situated rather than absolute. To be free does not mean to be unconstrained. It means to respond to constraints without pretending they absolve us. Sartre insists that recognizing limitation does not eliminate responsibility. It changes its form. One is not responsible for being oppressed, but one remains responsible for how one responds within oppression. This response frustrates critics who want freedom reduced to measurable capacity. Sartre refuses this reduction. Freedom for him is not power. It is non-identity with circumstance, the fact that no situation fully determines its response. Critics argue this preserves responsibility at the cost of realism. Sartre accepts this cost. He believes realism that dissolves responsibility is ethically dangerous. The criticism of moral relativism receives a similarly defiant response. Sartre does not deny that he rejects moral foundations. He denies that foundations are necessary for condemnation. Values are not arbitrary simply because they are created. They acquire weight through commitment and consequence. To choose is to universalize, not because a rule exists, but because action presents itself as an example. This move is often misunderstood. Sartre does not claim that every choice is equally valid. He claims that every choice claims validity. Others are therefore entitled to judge it. Ethics survives not through rules, but through exposure to judgment. Critics object that this offers no guidance in advance. Sartre agrees. Ethics is not a manual. It is a risk. This insistence leads directly to the most troubling criticism: violence. Sartre never fully retracts his willingness to tolerate violence under certain historical conditions. What he resists is the idea that tolerance equals endorsement. Violence remains tragic, contaminating and morally dangerous, even when deemed unavoidable. This is not a defense that satisfies his critics. Camus, and others like him, insist that allowing violence even conditionally erodes moral limits irreversibly. Sartre replies that refusing to confront structural violence preserves those limits only for the privileged. Here, Sartre does not retreat. He accepts that his position is dangerous. He insists that danger is unavoidable. The moral demand is not to remain pure, but to remain answerable. Violence does not disappear because one refuses it. It continues, inflicted by systems rather than individuals. This response leaves a residue. Even sympathetic readers recognize that Sartre offers no stable mechanism for limiting violence once justified. He relies on vigilance rather than rule. Critics argue vigilance is insufficient. Sartre accepts this risk. On bad faith, Sartre again resists simplification. He does not deny unconscious influence or psychological pressure. He insists only that human beings are never entirely reducible to them. Bad faith is not ignorance, it is evasion, the refusal to confront one's own implication. Critics argue this over-moralizes survival strategies. Sartre concedes that survival can involve evasion. What he refuses is the claim that evasion becomes innocence. This is a hard position. It places responsibility where compassion often wants to remove it. Sartre believes removing it erases agency. He would rather risk harshness than dissolve responsibility entirely. The critique of abstraction also forces revision. Sartre's later work becomes increasingly historical, collective, and material. He engages Marxism not to abandon existentialism, but to anchor it. Freedom is no longer a solitary drama. It becomes a social process shaped by institutions, movements, and history. This development is not a retreat from existentialism, it is its expansion. Still, critics argue the synthesis remains unstable. Freedom and structure never fully integrate. Sartre accepts the instability, he does not seek closure. Finally, critics point to Sartre's political misjudgments as evidence of philosophical failure. Sartre does not deny error, he refuses retrospective purity. Mistakes do not discredit responsibility, they confirm its risk. Sartre never claims to have lived his philosophy flawlessly. What matters for him is that philosophy does not exempt one from consequence. To act is to expose oneself to judgment, including judgment by history. This is where Sartre ultimately stands. He does not answer his critics by proving them wrong. He answers by accepting what their objections reveal, that freedom is dangerous, ethics lacks guarantees, and responsibility cannot be stabilized. These are not failures of his philosophy, they are its conditions. Sartre's thought does not promise moral safety, it promises honesty without shelter. Critics often want reassurance. Sartre refuses to provide it. What remains unresolved is precisely what makes his philosophy endure. How much responsibility can human beings bear? When does engagement become justification? When does restraint become complicity? Sartre does not resolve these questions. He insists we cannot avoid them. His philosophy survives criticism not because it answers everything, but because it refuses escape. It forces responsibility to remain visible, even where it becomes unbearable. That is why Sartre continues to provoke resistance. And that is why his critics remain essential to understanding him.